Everyone in the building believed Adrian Brooks was simply a quiet widower who checked badges at the front desk and never involved himself in anyone else's business. He arrived before the sun rose, nodded at the cleaning staff, and disappeared into the security office where he watched dozens of screens without ever seeming to care what was on them. Nobody imagined that behind those tired eyes lived a man who had once been the nightmare of international criminal networks, a man trained to end a threat in less time than it took most people to finish a sentence. So when Sophia Bennett's former boyfriend stormed into the lobby on a gray Seattle morning, grabbed her by the hair, and began beating her in front of hundreds of frozen employees, only one person rose from his chair. In exactly 10 seconds, the life of that violent man collapsed into ruins, and nobody in the company would ever look at Adrian Brooks the same way again. Adrian always arrived first. Long before the elevators filled with tired executives and the espresso machine in the break room began its daily hum, he was already walking the perimeter of the building, checking the doors, glancing at the cameras, memorizing faces that did not belong. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then, his answers were short, polite, and forgettable. The younger guards assumed he was simply an older man counting down the years until retirement, content to sit quietly behind a desk. None of them noticed the way his eyes tracked every exit in a room, or how his body remained angled toward the door even when he pretended to read a magazine. He had spent decades training himself to disappear into ordinary rooms, and he had never been more grateful for that skill than he was now, in this glass tower full of people who had no idea what quiet violence looked like. Sophia Bennett was the opposite of invisible. As chief operating officer, she ran meetings with a calm authority that made grown executives sit up straighter, and her decisions shaped the direction of an entire technology division. Colleagues admired her sharp mind and her refusal to be pushed around in negotiations, but there was a version of Sophia that almost nobody in the office had ever seen, a woman who flinched slightly whenever her phone buzzed with an unknown number, who kept her blinds closed even during the bright hours of the afternoon, who had learned to walk to her car with her keys already laced between her fingers. She had built an entire fortress around herself out of professionalism, and only the smallest cracks in that fortress ever showed. More than once, Adrian noticed her stepping into the stairwell to take a call, her voice dropping low and tense before she hung up without saying goodbye. He noticed the bouquet of white roses that appeared on her desk one Tuesday morning, and how she carried it straight to the trash can outside without ever reading the card. He noticed the way her shoulders tightened whenever a black vehicle idled a little too long across the street from the building. He said nothing, because it was not his place to ask questions, and because 2 decades of training had taught him that real threats rarely announced themselves loudly at first. They circled. They waited. They studied their target the way a predator studies the weakest point in a fence, and Adrian Brooks knew exactly what that kind of patience looked like, because he had spent years being that kind of patience himself. On a Thursday evening, as rain misted against the windows and most of the office had already gone home, the exterior cameras caught a dark SUV parked across the street for the 3rd night in a row. Adrian paused the footage, zoomed in on the plate, and wrote the numbers down in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. A notebook nobody in the building knew existed. He did not report it to management, because there was nothing yet to report. Only a feeling, the kind of feeling that had once saved his life more times than he could count. He closed the notebook, looked once more at the empty lobby, where Sophia's office light still glowed on the top floor, and settled back into his chair to wait for whatever was coming. The man behind the black SUV had a name that once meant something in certain circles of Seattle business, back when investors still returned his calls, and his name appeared on the covers of regional magazines. Ethan Cole had built a promising startup in his early 30s, courted headlines about disruptive innovation, and dated Sophia Bennett for nearly 2 years while both of their careers seemed to be rising together. But underneath the charm was a man who needed control the way other people needed air, and when his company began to crumble under bad decisions and worse investments, he needed somewhere to place the blame. Sophia became that place. In his mind, she had distracted him, doubted him, quietly sabotaged him by daring to succeed while his own empire fell apart around him. The truth, had he ever been willing to face it, was far less flattering to his own image. His company had failed because of decisions he refused to reconsider, even when every advisor around him urged caution. Expansions funded by debt he could not sustain, partnerships built on promises he never intended to keep. Rather than accept responsibility for choices he alone had made, he found it far easier to construct a narrative in which Sophia's success had somehow come at his expense, as though the world contained only a fixed amount of achievement, and she had simply claimed the share that belonged to him. That fiction became the foundation upon which every subsequent act of harassment was built, each message and each late-night appearance outside her building justified in his own mind, as a search for the fairness he believed had been stolen from him. After the breakup, Ethan's messages began slowly, almost reasonable at first, asking to talk things through, insisting he only wanted closure. Within weeks, the tone shifted into something colder and more insistent. Dozens of texts in a single night, accusing her of ruining his life, of owing him an explanation, of belonging to him whether she wanted to admit it or not. He started appearing outside restaurants where she was having dinner with friends, always claiming it was a coincidence, always smiling in a way that never reached his eyes. He hired someone to photograph her leaving the office, telling himself he was simply protecting his own interests, gathering proof of a betrayal only he could see. Sophia tried to do everything correctly. She saved the messages, documented the encounters, and eventually sat across from a tired attorney who told her gently that a restraining order required more concrete evidence than a pattern of discomfort. The system, built to react rather than prevent, offered her little beyond advice to be careful and to keep records. So she kept records. And she kept walking into work every morning with her chin up, refusing to let anyone see how exhausted she had become from constantly looking over her shoulder. Some nights, she sat alone in her apartment, with every light on, replaying the 2 years she had spent with Ethan, searching for the exact moment when charm had curdled into obsession, though she could never quite locate it. There had been small warning signs even in the beginning, a jealousy disguised as devotion, a need to know her location at all times disguised as concern. But she had excused each one individually, never allowing herself to see the pattern forming until it was already too late to simply walk away without consequence. She confided in almost no one, ashamed of how long she had ignored her own instincts, and that silence only deepened her isolation during the months when she needed support the most. A close friend eventually convinced her to file a formal complaint with the police, though the officers who took her statement seemed more interested in closing the file quickly than in understanding the slow, grinding terror of being watched by someone who insisted he still loved her. She left the station that day feeling smaller than when she had arrived, certain that if something serious eventually happened, there would be little anyone could do to stop it in time. It was a fear she carried quietly into every meeting, every hallway conversation, every late evening spent finishing reports long after her colleagues had already gone home. Adrian caught sight of Ethan twice, standing across the street with his hands in his coat pockets, staring up at the windows of the building, as though counting the floors until he found the one he wanted. Adrian recognized something in that stillness, the particular patience of a man rehearsing an outcome in his head before he had the courage to act on it. He did not approach him. He did not alert security to detain a man who had broken no visible law. Instead, he memorized the shape of his jacket, the slight limp in his left leg, the license plate of the black SUV, and filed every detail away in the same quiet part of his mind where he had once stored the movements of far more dangerous men. Nobody asked Adrian why he began arriving even earlier than usual, or why he requested extra footage from the cameras covering the parking structure. Nobody thought to question a man who had made himself so unremarkable that questioning him never occurred to anyone. Late one night, after the last light on the top floor finally went dark, Adrian sat alone in the security office and pulled up weeks of recorded footage, cross-referencing timestamps, building a timeline that existed nowhere except inside his own private files. He had learned long ago that the difference between tragedy and prevention was almost always preparation, and he intended to be prepared for whatever Ethan Cole eventually decided to do. The morning it finally happened began like any other. Gray light pressing against the windows, employees filing in with paper cups of coffee, the low murmur of Monday conversations filling the lobby. Ethan walked through the front doors with a visitor badge clipped carelessly to his jacket, having convinced the receptionist he had a meeting scheduled with a department that did not exist. For a moment he simply stood near the elevators, watching the crowd, waiting for Sophia to step off the elevator and into view. When she finally appeared, laughing softly at something a colleague had said, his expression changed instantly, the practiced calm sliding away to reveal something raw and furious underneath. He crossed the lobby in long, deliberate strides, calling her name in a voice loud enough to silence every conversation around him. Sophia's smile vanished the instant she recognized him, and her body went rigid with the kind of fear that only comes from months of anticipating exactly this moment. Ethan did not stop to talk. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her gasp, accusing her of destroying his life, of owing him everything he had lost, of thinking she could simply walk away without consequence. Sophia tried to pull free, telling him to let go, telling him this was not the place, but reasoning had never worked on Ethan Cole, and it did not work now. The lobby froze around them. Dozens of employees stood paralyzed near the security desk and the elevator banks, phones half raised, no one quite believing what they were witnessing in the middle of a Monday morning. Ethan's grip tightened, and when Sophia twisted away from him, his hand caught her hair instead. Yanking her backward, with enough force to make her cry out, he struck her across the face, the sound echoing off the marble floor, and then shoved her down hard enough that she landed on her hands and knees in front of everyone she worked with. Fear has a particular gravity in moments like these, pulling grown adults into stillness, convincing them that intervening might make everything worse. From roughly 15 meters away, standing near the security desk where he had been quietly reviewing the morning's badge logs, Adrian Brooks watched the entire scene unfold without a flicker of visible reaction. To anyone glancing his way, he appeared almost unnervingly calm, as though the chaos in front of him belonged to a television screen rather than real life. A few co-workers would later admit they assumed he was too frightened to act, an aging security guard, with no real training beyond checking identification badges. What none of them understood was that Adrian was not frozen. He was simply finishing the only calculation that mattered to him in that moment, measuring distance, angle, and the precise second Ethan's balance would shift enough to make him vulnerable. Ethan pulled back his arm to strike Sophia again, his face twisted with a rage that had been building for months, and that was the moment Adrian finally moved. He did not run. He did not shout a warning that would only give Ethan time to prepare. He crossed the distance between them, with an economy of motion that looked almost unremarkable, until you noticed how quickly the space had closed, and he placed himself directly between Ethan and the woman crumpled on the floor. His voice, when it came, was low and even, carrying none of the panic that filled the rest of the lobby. "Let go of her," Adrian said, and something in the flatness of his tone made several nearby employees instinctively step back, though none of them could have explained why. Ethan looked at him with open contempt, seeing only a middle-aged man in a plain security uniform, an obstacle beneath his notice. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and swung a fist toward Adrian's face. Certain the older man would either flinch or fall. What happened instead took less than 10 seconds, though everyone who witnessed it would later describe it as though time itself had slowed down. Adrian shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, redirected the punch past his shoulder, and in the same fluid motion locked Ethan's wrist and elbow into a position that folded the larger man forward with a sharp, involuntary cry of pain. Ethan tried to twist free, tried to throw a second strike with his other hand, but Adrian had already anticipated the movement, sweeping his leg and driving him down onto the marble floor with controlled, deliberate force. When Ethan reached toward his jacket, some buried instinct in Adrian recognized the motion instantly, and he pinned the arm before it could complete its intended path, later revealing a folding knife that had never left its sheath. Every movement Adrian made was precise, efficient, and stripped of anything resembling excess violence. The work of a man who understood exactly how much force was necessary and refused to use 1 ounce more. Within 10 seconds, Ethan Cole lay face down on the cold floor of the lobby, immobilized, gasping, and utterly stunned by how quickly his rage had turned into helplessness. The entire building seemed to exhale at once. Somewhere behind the crowd, a woman finally found her voice and called for building security to phone the police, though the threat itself had already been neutralized before anyone even reached for a phone. Sophia sat frozen on the floor, one hand pressed against her stinging cheek, staring up at the man who had crossed the lobby in seconds and dismantled her worst nightmare with an ease that felt almost impossible to comprehend. Around her, coworkers finally began to move, some rushing to help her up, others simply staring at Adrian as though seeing him for the very first time in the years. Many of them had worked beside him without truly noticing him at all. Sirens arrived within minutes, cutting through the tense murmur that had filled the lobby since Ethan Cole's rage exploded into violence. 2 patrol officers pushed through the gathered crowd, one of them immediately kneeling beside Sophia, while the other approached the man still restrained calmly on the floor. It was the detective who arrived shortly after. A tall man with graying hair and a folder tucked under his arm, who stopped mid-stride the moment his eyes landed on Adrian, standing quietly near the wall. His posture relaxed in a way that seemed strangely out of place given what had just happened. The detective's expression shifted from professional detachment to something close to disbelief. He crossed the lobby with quick steps, extended his hand, and addressed Adrian with a single word that made every employee within earshot go silent. He called him Sir, and the tone carried a weight of respect that none of them had ever heard directed at the quiet man from the security office. Whispers rippled through the crowd immediately. Co-workers, turning to one another with raised eyebrows, wondering what history could possibly exist between a homicide detective and a man most of them barely acknowledged in the break room. Olivia Grant, the company's chief executive officer, arrived just as the paramedics were checking Sophia's injuries, her heels clicking sharply against the marble as she pushed through the gathered employees. She had built her career on reading people quickly, and yet she found herself staring at Adrian with the same confusion rippling through everyone else. Unable to reconcile the unremarkable man she occasionally passed in the hallway with the composed figure, now speaking quietly with a homicide detective, as though they were old colleagues, she approached slowly, waiting for an explanation that nobody in the lobby seemed prepared to offer. Over the following hour, as officers took statements and Ethan Cole was led away in handcuffs still muttering threats under his breath, pieces of Adrian's history began to surface. First from the detective's careful explanations, and later from a background check the company's legal team insisted on running. Adrian Brooks, it turned out, had spent nearly 2 decades in an elite tier of military service most people only encountered in films, leading operations against organized threats that rarely made headlines because their success depended entirely on secrecy. He had trained new recruits in tactics designed to save lives rather than take them unnecessarily, and he had received commendations that remained sealed in classified files most civilians would never be permitted to read. The detective explained, quietly and away from the crowd, that Adrian had once been responsible for extracting hostages from situations most negotiators considered unsalvageable, that his name still carried weight in certain rooms, where very few names were remembered at all. He described a mission years earlier, in which Adrian had led a team into a collapsing situation overseas, and brought every single person home alive, an outcome so rare in that line of work that it had become something of a quiet legend among those who knew the real story. He mentioned commendations that existed only in restricted files, medals that had been presented in private ceremonies attended by almost no one, honors that Adrian had accepted with the same discomfort he now wore standing in the middle of a crowded corporate lobby. None of this had ever been mentioned in a break room conversation, never surfaced during a holiday party, never appeared on any biography or introduction. When Adrian had joined the company years earlier, he had submitted a resume that listed only general security experience, deliberately vague, carefully unremarkable, exactly the kind of application that guaranteed nobody would ask further questions. It had worked exactly as he intended for years, allowing him to move through his days without the weight of expectation or curiosity. Until one desperate man's rage had forced the truth into the open, in front of everyone. Nobody in the building had known, because Adrian had never wanted them to know. When his career in that world finally ended, quietly and by his own choice, He had deliberately sought out a life defined by stillness, rather than recognition, a life where nobody expected anything extraordinary from him, and where he could simply exist without the weight of his own history following him into every room. He had taken the security position because it allowed him to remain useful without ever being seen. And for years that arrangement had suited him perfectly, until the morning a violent man forced his hand in front of everyone. Olivia finally reached him, studying his face as though searching for the answer to a question she had not yet asked aloud. Around them, employees whispered his rank, his years of service, fragments of a story none of them had access to in full. And Adrian simply stood there absorbing the attention with visible discomfort, the same discomfort of a man who had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of scrutiny. He did not offer explanations or elaborate on his past. He only asked quietly whether Sophia was going to be all right, his attention already shifting away from himself and back toward the woman who mattered more to him in that moment than any story about who he used to be. In the days that followed, Adrian did something that surprised even the detective assigned to the case. He arrived at the police station, carrying a small external drive containing months of carefully organized evidence, time-stamped footage from the building's exterior cameras showing the black SUV parked across the street on 9 separate occasions, photographs he had discreetly taken of Ethan loitering near the entrance, and a written log documenting every date and time he had observed the man watching the building. He had never mentioned any of it to Sophia or to management, choosing instead to quietly build a case in the background, the same patient discipline he had once used to track far more dangerous targets in another life. The lead attorney reviewing the file exhaled slowly as she scrolled through the documentation, admitting she had rarely seen a case assembled with this much precision outside of a formal investigation. Every piece of evidence was labeled, cross-referenced, and legally admissible, forming a timeline so complete that any argument suggesting Ethan's actions were a single moment of lost temper collapsed under the weight of months of premeditated stalking. There would be no room for a defense built on sympathy or misunderstanding, because Adrian had spent half a year removing every possible excuse before Ethan Cole even understood he was being watched. Sophia sat across from Adrian a few days later, in a quiet corner of the office cafeteria, her cheek still faintly bruised, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. She asked him plainly why he had done all of it, why a man who spoke maybe 10 sentences to her over the entire time they had worked in the same building had spent months quietly protecting her from a threat she had barely managed to survive on her own. Adrian considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice steady and without any trace of performance. "I don't like watching innocent people get hunted," he said, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to carry more weight than any elaborate explanation could have offered. Sophia studied him carefully, searching for the ego or the expectation she had learned to anticipate from most men who did something significant for her. But she found none of it in his expression. There was no hint that he wanted credit, no suggestion that his actions came with strings attached, only the quiet conviction of someone who had simply done what he believed needed to be done. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something loosen in her chest, a small, unfamiliar relief at being near a man who expected absolutely nothing from her in return. Over the following weeks, conversations between them became more frequent, starting with brief exchanges near the security desk and gradually extending into longer talks after most of the office had gone home for the evening. Sophia learned, slowly and in fragments, that Adrian had lost his wife several years earlier, a loss that had ultimately driven him away from the career he had once excelled in. The specifics remained private, offered only in careful pieces, but she understood enough to recognize that his quietness was not emptiness, but the deliberate stillness of a man who had survived something that reshaped him completely. He told her once, on a rainy evening when the office had emptied early and neither of them seemed in any hurry to leave, that the hardest part of losing someone was not the day it happened, but every ordinary day afterward that kept arriving regardless of whether he was ready for them. He had thrown himself back into work for a while, taking on missions that other men considered too dangerous to accept, chasing something he could never quite name until he finally understood he was simply trying to outrun grief rather than face it. It was only after stepping away entirely, choosing stillness over motion, that he had slowly begun to feel like a person again rather than a function performing a role. He had walked away from repeated offers to return to specialized work, choosing instead a life defined by simplicity, ordinary mornings, ordinary evenings, and the absence of anyone depending on him for anything beyond checking badges at a front desk. Sophia found herself drawn to that quiet resolve, to a man who had already proven himself capable of extraordinary things and had chosen, deliberately, to want none of the recognition that came with them. For the first time in years, she was speaking with a man who was not trying to impress her, was not performing confidence, was not angling towards something he wanted from her. And the novelty of that honesty settled into her slowly, like warmth returning to a room that had been cold for a very long time. She began to notice small things about him that nobody else in the office ever seemed to catch. The way he always left a little early on certain dates without explanation, the careful attention he paid whenever anyone mentioned feeling unsafe or overwhelmed, the quiet respect he extended to every person regardless of their position within the company. None of it felt performative, because none of it was meant for an audience. He simply moved through the world the way he always had, long before anyone knew his history, treating decency as a baseline rather than an achievement worth announcing. While Sophia began to breathe easier for the first time in months, Ethan Cole sat in a holding cell running through every possible way to reframe what had happened in his favor. Once released on bail pending trial, he wasted no time attempting to rewrite the narrative, posting long messages online, insisting he had been the true victim of an unprovoked assault by an unstable security guard, claiming Sophia had orchestrated the entire incident to embarrass him publicly. He reached out to old business contacts, spinning a story about excessive force and corporate conspiracy, hoping enough noise might create doubt before the case ever reached a courtroom. What Ethan failed to understand, even after everything that had already happened to him, was the sheer volume of evidence now working against him. The building's cameras had captured every second of his attack from multiple angles, showing with brutal clarity exactly who struck first and exactly how measured Adrian's response had been. Traffic cameras along the street corroborated the months of stalking documented in Adrian's files, confirming the presence of his vehicle on dates that matched precisely with the timestamps in the evidence log. Co-workers who witnessed the assault gave consistent statements, and even the officer who arrived first on scene testified that Adrian had used only the force necessary to restrain a violent, uncooperative man. When the trial finally began on a cold morning in early winter, the courtroom filled quickly, curious onlookers drawn by a story that had already spread through certain corners of the local news. Ethan's attorney attempted several strategies, first suggesting his client suffered from an undiagnosed emotional crisis, then implying that Sophia had provoked the confrontation by refusing to speak with him privately. Neither argument survived contact with the mountain of documented evidence Adrian had assembled, evidence so thorough that the prosecution barely needed to raise its voice to make its case. Sophia testified with a steadiness that surprised even herself, describing months of harassment in a clear, measured voice that left little room for doubt about the pattern of behavior that had led to that terrifying Monday morning. Over 3 days, the prosecution methodically walked the jury through every layer of the case, beginning with the earliest recorded sighting of Ethan's vehicle outside the office and ending with the final, brutal seconds captured on the lobby cameras from 4 separate angles. Jurors watched the footage in silence, the room heavy with the particular discomfort that comes from witnessing real violence rather than a dramatized version of it. Several members of the jury glanced instinctively toward Adrian during the playback, watching the recorded version of a man who had moved with such precision that it barely seemed to require any effort at all, and comparing it to the quiet, unassuming figure now seated calmly in the gallery. Adrian testified as well, though he offered nothing beyond exactly what had happened, refusing to embellish or dramatize a single detail of his own actions. His testimony carried a quiet authority that seemed to settle the room, a man clearly uninterested in being seen as a hero, simply stating facts in the same steady tone he used for everything else. When the defense attorney attempted to suggest that his response had been excessive, that a man of his training should have simply called for help instead of intervening directly, Adrian answered without hesitation that he had made a judgment in real time, based on the immediate danger in front of him, and that waiting for someone else to arrive was never a risk he had been willing to take with another person's safety. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a verdict, finding Ethan Cole guilty on charges of assault, stalking, and harassment, a combination of convictions that carried significant prison time under state law. The judge, reviewing the extensive record of premeditated behavior, imposed a sentence considerably harsher than Ethan's attorney had hoped for, along with a permanent restraining order preventing any future contact with Sophia Bennett in any form. Ethan was also ordered to pay restitution covering both the physical and psychological damage his actions had caused, a financial burden that would follow him long after his release. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced once toward Sophia, his expression unreadable, before disappearing through the side door without another word. Outside the courthouse, Sophia stood in the pale winter sunlight and allowed herself to fully exhale for what felt like the first time in over a year. The fear that had shaped so many of her decisions, the careful routes home, the constant awareness of her surroundings, the silence she had carried instead of asking for help, finally began to loosen its grip on her chest. She turned to Adrian, who stood a respectful distance away as always, and found herself unable to fully articulate the depth of her gratitude, settling instead for a simple, sincere thank you that seemed to carry more weight between them than any longer speech could have offered. Back at the office, Olivia Grant called Adrian into her private conference room, closing the door behind them with a seriousness that suggested this was no ordinary conversation. She laid out an offer without hesitation, proposing to create an entirely new position for him, Director of Corporate Security, complete with a salary that reflected his experience rather than his current modest title. She explained that a man with his background deserved far more responsibility and recognition than a front desk badge check, and that the company would be fortunate to have someone of his caliber formally overseeing its safety operations. Adrian listened carefully, considering the offer with the same measured patience he brought to everything else, and then declined it politely but firmly. He explained that he had built his current life specifically to avoid the pressures and visibility that came with leadership roles, that he had no interest in titles or increased authority, and that he found genuine peace in the simplicity of his current position. Olivia studied him for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to anyone turning down more money and more power, before finally nodding with something close to admiration. Word of his refusal spread quietly through the office in the following days, and rather than diminishing the respect people held for him, it only deepened it, employees recognizing in his choice a rare kind of integrity that had nothing to do with ambition. Months passed, and the building slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, though something subtle had shifted within it. Sophia moved through the hallways with a lightness that had been absent for a long time, no longer glancing nervously toward the entrance each time the doors opened, no longer flinching at unfamiliar numbers appearing on her phone screen. Colleagues noticed the change without fully understanding its source, commenting quietly that she seemed more like herself again, whatever version of herself had existed before fear had quietly reshaped so much of her daily life. She began stopping by the security office more often, not out of necessity, but because she genuinely enjoyed the calm, uncomplicated company of the man who worked there. Their conversations grew easier with each passing week, drifting from careful professional topics into gentler territory, shared opinions on old films, quiet reflections on the kind of peace that comes only after surviving something difficult. Adrian found himself looking forward to those brief exchanges more than he cared to admit, surprised by how naturally he had begun opening small pieces of himself to a woman who had never once demanded that he perform strength or hide his own scars. On a mild evening in early spring, long after most of the office had emptied for the day, Sophia lingered near the security desk instead of heading straight to her car. She told Adrian she wanted to properly thank him, not with words exchanged quickly in passing hallways, but with dinner somewhere quiet, somewhere they could speak without the weight of the building's routines pressing in around them. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, weighing the invitation with the same careful consideration he brought to every decision that mattered, and then allowed a small, genuine smile to cross his face as he agreed. It was not gratitude that made him say yes, though gratitude certainly lived somewhere in the exchange between them. It was something quieter and far more significant, the unfamiliar sensation of wanting to be known by someone again after years of deliberately keeping the world at a careful distance. He had built his entire life around remaining unseen, convinced that invisibility was the safest way to honor everything and everyone he had lost. And yet here was a woman who had seen exactly who he was in the worst possible circumstances and had not looked away. They chose a small restaurant a few blocks from the office. Quiet enough that conversation came easily without the pressure of curious eyes. Over the course of the evening, Sophia spoke more openly than she had in years, describing the exhaustion of pretending to be fine for months while quietly falling apart beneath the surface, the loneliness of carrying a threat that nobody else seemed to fully believe was as serious as it felt. Adrian listened without interrupting, offering only the occasional quiet acknowledgement, the kind of listening that comes from someone who understands that not every wound needs to be fixed, only witnessed. Near the end of the meal, as the restaurant slowly emptied around them, Sophia set down her glass and looked at him directly, her voice softer than usual. She told him that on the morning everything happened, in the seconds before he crossed the lobby, she had genuinely believed no one was going to help her, that she would simply have to survive it alone, the way she had learned to survive so many smaller cruelties before it. Adrian held her gaze steadily, understanding the weight behind her words, and answered in the same calm, unhurried tone he used for everything that truly mattered to him. Sometimes, he said quietly, all it takes is one person who refuses to look away, and it can change the entire direction of someone's life. Sophia felt something settle deep in her chest at those words, not the relief of danger passing, but the quieter, steadier relief of finally being seen by someone who had no interest in taking anything from her. Outside, the Seattle rain had softened into a light mist, blurring the streetlights into gentle halos along the sidewalk. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one felt any urgency to rush away from the moment they were sharing. In the months that followed, Ethan Cole began serving his sentence far from the city where he had once tried to control every part of Sophia's world, his name slowly fading from conversations that had once revolved around fear of what he might do next. Sophia rebuilt her life on her own terms, stepping fully into her role as chief operating officer, without the shadow of constant dread following her through every hallway and every late evening walk to her car. She no longer flinched at unfamiliar numbers, no longer avoided certain streets, no longer measured her days by how carefully she could remain unseen. Adrian remained exactly who he had always been, quiet, steady, unwilling to trade his simplicity for recognition even after the entire office had learned the extraordinary history he had spent years trying to leave behind. He continued arriving before sunrise, continued walking the same familiar perimeter each morning, and continued treating every person in the building with the same understated respect, regardless of their title or position. Yet something had changed in the way people looked at him now, not with awe or curiosity, but with a quiet, lasting kind of respect reserved for someone who had proven, when it mattered most, exactly what kind of man he truly was. Between Adrian and Sophia, something patient and unforced continued to grow, built not on grand gestures or urgent declarations, but on the steady accumulation of small, honest moments, shared coffees before the office filled with noise, quiet conversations after long days, the simple comfort of being near someone who never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Neither of them rushed toward labels or promises, understanding instinctively that whatever was forming between them deserved the same careful patience that had defined every meaningful choice in both of their lives. The city continued its familiar rhythm of rain and gray mornings, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening inside one unremarkable office tower. Yet for two people who had each survived their own private battles, that transformation meant everything. Justice had been served in a courtroom, but healing continued long after the verdict was read, carried forward not through dramatic declarations, but through the steady, patient presence of someone willing to stand beside another person, without ever demanding recognition for doing so. Colleagues who had once walked past Adrian without a second glance now found themselves greeting him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the story. Everyone now knew, and everything to do with the man he continued to be every single day afterward. He never used his history to gain influence. never leveraged the respect he had earned into anything beyond the same quiet, steady presence he had always offered. Sophia often told him, in the easy way people speak when trust has fully settled between them, that his refusal to change even after everyone learned who he truly was had taught her more about character than anything he had done in those first extraordinary 10 seconds. As autumn returned to Seattle nearly a year after that terrible Monday morning, the rain fell just as it always had, gray and steady against the windows of the same glass tower where everything had changed. Sophia stood at her office window one evening, watching the drops trace their way down the glass, and found herself thinking not of fear, but of gratitude, for a life that had somehow found its way back to steadiness after being shaken so completely. Somewhere below, in the quiet security office, where he had spent so many early mornings and late evenings, Adrian Brooks continued his rounds, unremarkable to any stranger passing through the lobby, and exactly the kind of man the people who truly knew him would trust with anything that mattered. In the end, the story was never really about the 10 seconds it took to stop a violent man in a crowded lobby, but about everything that came quietly afterward. The slow rebuilding of trust, the gentle return of safety, and the discovery that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away when it matters most.